and welcome everybody to another No Identity Digital Forum here, focused on investments and startups in the digital identity ecosystem. My name is Travis Jarae. I'm the founder CEO of One World Identity. We're a research and advisory firm focused on identity, trust, and the data economy. And boy, 2020, 2021 have been already off to a great start. But really quickly, just want to tell you guys a little bit about who we are and what we do. We've been around for about 5 years, and we do these 6 items here. We do go-to-market strategy, growth strategy, market intelligence, product design, and most recently, a lot of transaction services, which we're going to talk a lot about today, both here with our first guest, Cameron, as well as Eric in a few minutes. But really quickly, by the numbers, like I said, we're 5 years old. We have about 22 full-time employees here, but a network of over 300 globally. So we've been doing a lot of global work over the past couple of years here. We've launched about 25 products, and we've done about 4 billion in client transaction services and generated roughly about $80 million in revenue for those products so far. But just to kind of jump right into it, this session is Riding the Digital Wave to Identity Strategy, our first investor forum here of the year. And just to kind of give you a hint of what we're going to be doing here, we're going to be talking about our new 2020 identity landscape. Then we're going to be digging into some of those investing trends. Who are those movers and shakers in 2021? What to look out for? And then our startup spotlight here, decentralized identity, the nuts and bolts of an emerging industry with Gattaca. Very exciting event here for you guys here today. And just to jump right into it, we're going to be introducing our new identity landscape. And I want to welcome someone that you all are very familiar with, Cameron D'Ambrosi, Managing Director of OWI, to the digital stage. Welcome, Cameron.
Thanks for the invitation. Glad to be here.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. No, I think, one of the things that you and I get asked most about is probably the landscape, something that you and I developed back in 2016 and have since continued to work on a day-to-day basis. So this is always a fun journey for you and I specifically. And just for everybody who's listening, the way that Cameron and I actually go through this landscaping approach is typically we lock ourselves into a room for many, many days, and we knock it out over a whiteboard, analyzing data, seeing all the trends that happened during the past year and what we're expecting into the future, and then piecing the whole thing back together at the end. So it's really great to have you join me on this one here, Cameron.
Yeah, I think you're spot on when it comes to maybe the landscape driving more of the conversations that I certainly have out in industry more than anything else, and really excited to share that perspective. And certainly for anyone listening, if there's anything that we don't cover in our presentation, drop those questions in the chat. Would love to answer them in the Q&A session at the end here, or don't ever hesitate to drop us a line, email, LinkedIn, carrier pigeon. We accept all forms of communication here at OWI.
Well, with that, just jumping right into it a little bit, because I want to give the audience here, if you're not super familiar with our landscape, and maybe you just know us from No Identity and being part of this community with us, just to give you kind of a bit of a background on this exact landscape. So back in 2016, when we first started this, we were really trying to figure out what is digital identity, what is identity, and how are these pieces working together? Who are the major players in the space? How should folks like us, like you, be engaging in this ecosystem? And when we first started it, we had roughly 300 companies on our landscape. As you can see here on the top left, it was quite small. But over time, when we started to dig in a bit more, and when this market started to actually form itself in 2017 and 2018, we looked at it from a different way. We actually looked at it from building blocks, platforms and enablers, and consumer applications. And that's actually what you see there in that 2018 identity landscape. And that one, we had over 3,000 companies listed on it. And in that case, we were trying to piece together, what is the influence? Where are things actually starting from, and where are things ending up? So trying to draw some sorts of correlation between company A and company Z, and then everything in between those two companies, including external factors, internal factors, changes in employee staff, changes in regulation, changes in consumer sentiment, you name it. We were trying to figure out how do we actually measure this market and how do we look at it? And that actually led us to our 2019 identity landscape, something that we created in 2019 and into 2020, which is obviously not just, physically different in terms of look and size, but also a much broader tool, right? We actually look at this as a tool for us to be able to evaluate problem statements. We look at this as a tool to be able to piece together use cases. We use this as a tool to measure actual market segmentation, more so than just trying to throw companies or logos into a graphic that we can share online. And so as you can see here in 2019, this is when we started to actually think more about what sits underneath this landscape and how are the players playing together. And to dig into this a little bit, we wanted to break down this highly fragmented market into solution segments. And so in the past, you might have heard us reference these things as market segments, but now we're referencing them as solution segments. Why? Because all of these things are not a single standalone market anymore. Companies are starting to grow. They're either bolting on inorganically or they are growing organically into multiple segments to cover additional use cases as they arise, either strategically or opportunistically. And so if you wanted to use this as a tool, and something we will dig into in future forums, if you want to use this as a tool, you can actually start to map out your current state and see how this actually maps out to different use cases and identify new opportunities or potential risks to your business. The way that we look at this is we try to find that common denominator underneath each solution segment. Right here, we actually call out deterministic, probabilistic, or self-managed data. Obviously, the data here in our perspective is the piece that's tying all these things together. These are the common denominator. And as you can see in the blue is our deterministic data. This is your first party data, the attributes known to be true. In the yellow there is that probabilistic data, that predicted data based on relational patterns. And then lastly, in that gray is that self-managed data or that individual attested data. And what we try to do with that data is to measure which has dominance over the solution segments adjacent to it. So these market segments are not just thrown up here willy-nilly or for in a thoughtless manner. Actually, each market segment builds onto the adjacent market segment itself. And when you layer on that data component underneath it, whether that's deterministic, probabilistic, or self-managed data, again, looking at dominant data types, you can obviously argue that many of these cover all three, but looking at the dominant data type within that solution segment, we can start to measure which solution segment has influence over the adjacent market segments, or solution segments. And in this case, we can start to identify platforms, enablers in what we call golden cog opportunities. And so what you can see here is a different view of that same map, now without the type of data sitting underneath it, but now looking at either if it's a golden cog, an enabler, or a platform solution. And in this case, we are defining our platforms as solution segments that are typically partnering or going to market directly, but with partnerships underlying each of its products or solution sets. As an enabler, you are likely partnering with one of these platforms to sell your services, but very rarely, maybe not going direct to for sales channels. And then lastly are our golden cogs, which are our current enablers that have the propensity to become platforms. And when we look at this market, we do see the value being in the platforms. However, there are some enablers out there right now that can become platforms, and over the past couple of years have become platforms, which we'll show you in a bit here with our 2021 landscape. But just to reiterate, because this is a key point here, we have platforms, enablers, and golden cogs. Our golden cogs are enablers currently that can become platform solutions if internal factors work out, if external factors work out, right? There obviously needs to be the tailwinds for these different solution segments to work to give them that opportunity for growth and scale. And lastly, this year, this is a different type of way that we started to look at this landscape. And this is actually, I think, one of Cameron's best ideas here is to overlay the influence within the market segments themselves, in this case, the solution segments themselves, excuse me, what you can see here is we have two very highly influential, likely platforms sitting right in the middle of this map: identity and access management and fraud prevention and risk management platforms. If you're thinking to yourself, that makes sense, well, good. That means this actually works out. But what's around it is actually much more important. This influential barrier, this influential kind of fat layer between this platform grouping in the center here is really where we want to spend a lot of our time, especially when we're talking about growth areas and growth opportunities, as well as risk areas and risk opportunities. And so we can look around here. This is the 2020 or 2019 and 2020 landscape. We have several influential players, several, obviously most of the map here are influenced players. These are likely to be point solutions as we call out, but we have two highly influential, likely platform solutions. And if you look here, we have our three golden cog opportunities that we called out previously were mobile identity device intelligence, identity resolution, and one that's considered considered influence, which was identity proofing, which of course we have seen play out quite and make big strides this year and last year with COVID-19.
I just to kind of hit on how we are thinking about these problems and solutions more broadly. I think a lot of this goes back to thinking about digital identity not as a what, but as a how. A lot of the focus for us, I think, snapped into place around how these market segments fit together and what the future holds when you think about digital identity and these market segments, not as solutions kind of in and of themselves, but as vehicles to achieve something else. You don't identity and access management, very helpful, very useful, obviously critical for all types of enterprises and for consumers, but nobody wants to do IAM. You don't seek to access manage. You seek to get access to an account to move money. You seek to get access to an account to send communications or complete transactions. And so thinking about why you are allowing or why you need these solutions, which is in the furtherance of an end goal, not as a goal themselves, I think really is what caused us to be able to categorize some of these into these segments here in terms of influence, influential, or highly influential.
Yeah, that's a great point, Cameron. And it will play out a bit more into what you've all been waiting for, our 2021 identity landscape. We're very proud of this. This has been, we spent a lot of time crunching the numbers, seeking to figure out what's working, where our product roadmap's going, who's building what, why, and how. And, still at the base of everything, it comes down to the data, right? So again, deterministic, probabilistic, and self-managed data. We've seen some trends this year, which we're going to talk about a lot more. But generally speaking, this map looks more like a Pangea, less than having kind of that peninsula breakdown off to the side there on our previous one. We're starting to see market segments either collapse into each other or to actually grow out and become solution segments on their own. In such cases that you can see consent management platforms and master data management, something that was previously grouped together is now actually split apart as its own two things. We've also added some ones that we're going to talk about here in a second. And then we've seen some market solution segments actually shift around the map and become a bit more influential. Again, we're going to talk about that here in a second. But before we really dig into kind of the trends of everything, I want to introduce you to the new solution segments on this map. So like I just mentioned before, we have our consent management platforms and our master data management platforms splitting out to be their own beings, because we actually are starting to now see additional use cases that can use simply master data management or consent management platforms. No longer can they actually be grouped together when we start mapping out different use cases based on opportunity. We also added 3 new cybersecurity focused solution segments with endpoint security, network and infrastructure security, and antivirus. Why did we do this? Because we are seeing a massive push from cybersecurity, traditionally enterprise cybersecurity or enterprise focused cybersecurity companies into this space, right? So you can look at your Norton LifeLocks, your Avast, etc., kind of making a big push into this space through their current products. And it makes a ton of sense. They have large infrastructure. They've already built up a pretty significant grouping of users or user bases with their antivirus and identity theft protection services. We expect to see more of this cybersecurity influence on the identity landscape going forward. And the last one here that I'll call out before I turn it over to Cameron is digital identity wallets. This is one that we used to call, I believe it was personal identity products. And it was where we would drop things that were very much consumer application based. They could be a biometrics ring. They could be a personal door lock system for yourself. They could be a digital identity wallet, right? But what we found over time is that a lot of those pure consumer application plays no longer were really relevant to the identity landscape. We were not seeing the identity ring being something that we were going to actually put into a use case scenario when we're trying to pan out go-to-market strategy. And so what we did see a lot of is digital identity wallet growth. And we've seen that not just from the traditional players in the space focused on digital identity wallets, but also a lot of big tech companies, whether you're Apple, Google, or other, building out their own digital identity wallets for credential management and reuse.
Yeah, I mean, so many. We could spend hours talking through this, but I think to hit on some of the points that I find the most relevant to these new updates is in many ways, tying back to that point I made earlier, which is we view digital identity not as a what, but as a how. Because of the evolution we have seen across all of these segments, there is demand for some of these new solution segments to tie into digital identity ecosystems and facilitate those use cases. And in some way, I think why we are seeing, especially on this right side of the chart here, when it comes to endpoint security, the network infrastructure piece, the antivirus piece, we are seeing these players moving into digital identity because they are recognizing that they are, in fact, digital identity companies. It is not that these market segments were not just as relevant to digital identity, 3, 4, even 5 years ago. It is purely, I think, in some ways, a mindset that these companies finally recognize that, wow, we are very well positioned to understand the relationship between the physical user behind their device and their tie to that device itself, and that this has tremendous application to the broader digital identity space. And in many ways, nothing about their product changed at all. It was just the realization that they had this tremendous asset and have now thought to begin leveraging that and moving into the digital identity space proper, which I think is really fascinating. In some ways, this almost is a throwback to the first digital identity landscape that we put out, where we had, I think, a lot of the companies that might have fit into these segments on the map, and we just didn't see the traction at the time in terms of these players recognizing the foothold that they may have had. And we kind of struck them because we didn't see that movement and didn't feel that they were necessarily necessary to include as we sharpened our focus and as we moved from our original vision for the landscape, which was a bit more of a traditional Lumascape. We had it broken into 3 layers, kind of the consumer applications, the platforms, and then the building blocks and enabling technologies. And as we refined this into, this modern honeycombs version, as we like to call it internally, or some of our clients are fond of calling this, they had kind of fallen off the edge because we just weren't seeing in the market this acknowledgement that I think we had forecast in some ways. Well, that worm has turned as of 2021. So welcome to the party, pal, as John McClane might say. And I think you're seeing that on the left side of this graph as well when it comes to consent management platforms. I think this is a reflection and a realization of the central importance that we are now seeing consumers place on data privacy as they're becoming more aware of their rights, in conjunction with the market influence of these regulations like GDPR, like CCPA, like other regulations we're seeing globally that are forcing platforms to give consumers more granularity and more control over their data. That has really brought consent management into the conversation. And I think those consent management platforms, again, that in many cases have been around for years now, are recognizing, oh, this is a digital identity challenge. And this consent, this touch point that we are forging with the consumer and with their data may in reality have a much broader application beyond just something like, hey, be able to blow your personal data out of this platform's database when you no longer want to maintain your account with them. Again, I think the common thread here in many cases is this forging of the relationship between a user in, meat space, wet carbon version, whatever you want to call the human itself, and that relationship they have with their digital data as well as with their device. And I think we're seeing that become more and more relevant, being able to rely on that device as a proxy for a human, especially a mobile device, because how many of us are attached at the hip to our smartphones all day, every day, both in terms of the velocity of those data attributes that we're feeding into the digital identity ecosystem, making those extremely valuable. And the fact that, when you lose your device or when it gets stolen or when it would get taken over maliciously, you are probably going to recognize that very, very quickly as a consumer. I know you leave your phone in a cab. Well, back when you could take cabs places, maybe we'll be taking cabs soon again. But back when you could travel, even if you did lose your phone, I mean, what's the maximum number of minutes that you're going to go before you realize that you have misplaced your phone and it's out of your control? Pretty quick, probably. And that makes this tremendously useful, especially for kind of these fraud and risk use cases. So I think we can move on to the next slide before I beat a dead horse here. But the trend here again, digital identity not as a what, but as a how, and that linkage between humans and those devices really being critical as we move into 2021.
Yeah, that's a really great point, Cameron. And as you can see that, one of the big areas that we have seen this shift in, just as you kind of mentioned here, is the need for things like certifications, especially when we're looking at IDOT as this next big kind of bastion of the space with, kind of coming into an influential enabler as itself. And we're expecting that to slowly creep itself in as there is this greater connection between person and device down the line. So we are expecting kind of this upper right hand area to again kind of push itself in and start to force itself into the conversation. One of the most interesting things that we did see when we started to measure the influence of each solution segment this year is our call on mobile identity and device intelligence being a golden cock opportunity has come to fruition. Now, obviously, we are seeing companies like Prove and Telesign and Boku, TMT Analysis, Infobip, others really starting to see some big traction and huge success as they continue to grow. But also, now that they're highly influential as solution segments, they need to be careful too, right? They need to watch themselves. They need to make sure that they're making the right partnerships, that they're focusing on all of the competitors, because now everybody's going to be gunning for them. Now this is a time for inorganic growth for these types of companies. And we're starting to see that already, right? That's one thing that definitely over the last, 4 or 5 months and going forward 4 or 5 months, we're going to see a ton of inorganic activity from the IAM players, from the fraud prevention and risk management players, and we're going to go ahead and put ourselves on a limb here, this mobile identity and device intelligence layer, because they need to build out this more complete, comprehensive stack to really solidify themselves as the platform solutions that can remain highly influential in the space. Also with this, we found very interesting are just the number of companies that, number of solution segments that have become influential. Right now, you can see here just that edge ring is becoming influenced. And so, what does that actually mean? Well, for us, that actually means, for one, that the community is coming together, right? Which is great. Standards are starting to actually become standard, which is phenomenal. Two, we're seeing interoperability start to play out. We're seeing cross collaboration, whether you're from cybersecurity and working with a risk and compliance group, or you're working in the future MarTech or AdTech division, right? These companies are all now starting to work together. So we're not only just seeing some form of communication and realization that this is digital identity as a space, but we're also seeing cross-industry collaboration. And I think that's what the biggest thing that I took away from this 2021 influential solutions map. I don't know, Cameron, what were your thoughts on this particular kind of visual as it started to pan out when we layered in the data?
Yeah, in some ways, I do feel like I'm hitting on many of the points I hit on previously, which is, again, mobile identity device intelligence, moving continually to an area of critical importance, being able to take data sets that may previously were being leveraged, but maybe not necessarily thought of as digital identity attributes, again, becoming critically important, and really centering this conversation around, again, applications and how digital identity can serve as this horizontal layer. We kind of founded OWI again on the premise that digital identity was a fundamentally broken construct. This was going on five and a half years ago now. That we had too many silos. We were not thinking about digital identity as a true horizontal. These digital identities were stuck in industry-specific verticals, and we really needed to dynamite those walls, break down those barriers, get everyone, using the same vernacular, talking about leveraging the same technologies. And I think it's really exciting to see that we are making progress finally towards that end. In some ways, I think it may be one of those things where what's the cliche I'm thinking of? It's like going bankrupt. It first happens gradually and then all at once. We might finally get to that tipping point where I think some of these pieces start snapping into place and the dominoes start falling, and it turns from a trickle into a deluge. So optimistic about what 2021 holds. I think in many ways we are enjoying a tailwind from COVID because of the fact that we have forced so many industries that I think used physical interactions as a crutch for why they didn't adopt digital first solutions. COVID has been horrible in so many ways, but I think if there has been one benefit to people being stuck at home and work from home becoming a norm across a lot of industries, is if you didn't have a robust digital identity solution for your business, you either came up with one quick, or in many cases you really lost a ton of your business. And so we've seen a digital identity really become a competitive differentiator in a lot of industries. And I think in many ways, it's a one-way street. Once you get consumers hooked on how flexible a truly enabled digital identity layer to conduct their business is, there is no going back, because it doesn't necessarily preclude doing things in person or across whatever channel you prefer, whether that's desktop, whether that's mobile, whether that's in person. But when you have that flexibility, I don't think consumers ever want to go back to feeling constrained or pigeonholed into kind of any one channel. So really excited for what 2021 holds.
Yeah, and I think you hit on a few things there, Cameron, that kind of goes to this next slide. And I moved it to this next slide for the audience to kind of see a little bit of those trends that you were talking about as you were going through them. But these are some of the early market shifts to note. Now, we've been tracking against this landscape now for about 4 months, trying to figure out exactly, where are we going to see big areas of change or shift. So far, you see 3 kind of external forces coming in. Obviously, we can expand this quite a bit. But what you can see here is we're seeing new entrants or external entrants coming in between the network and infrastructure security and the antiviruses segments. And so we are expecting that grouping of cybersecurity companies that are focused there to actually kind of break through from that side, and with a lot of money, capital, and resources behind them. So be on the lookout up at the top right. Down a little bit below that's this kind of the gap between identity theft protection and password managers, very consumer centric. As Cameron was talking about, one of the big areas of 2020 is consumerism. We all kind of learned to shop online, engage online, go to school online, work online, everything online. But really, it put the consumer into the driver's seat, a lot of conversations. And I think for many of us that have been talking about consumer-centric identity solutions for many, many years, something that we call Wave 3 identity solutions here at OWI, talking about credential reuse, whether that's through decentralized identity schemes or other, really the core idea here is consumer first identity or consumer identity. And so we are seeing a huge opening here in that consumer identity bucket to the bottom right. And it's going to come between those password managers through that identity theft protection bucket and into that digital identity wallet solution segment area, which kind of brings me to the digital identity solutions, digital identity wallets to identity proofing. In order for these digital identities wallets to actually work, they're going to need to have both low assurance and high assurance use cases in them. This means everything from single sign-on for your Spotify account or whatever account that you want to log into, all the way up through your mobile driver's license, right? And we've seen a handful of companies already start to make announcements in this space and push forward with it. There's a lot of initiatives that are underway that may not be announced yet, but have been in the works now for close to a year, if not longer. We're expecting this to be the future, a digital identity wallet that includes your identity proofing components, right? Be able to proof yourself and be able to credential your driver's license, your passport, whatever it is, your government issued identity. We're expecting to see that move forward with there. Moving to the left slightly, the fraud prevention and risk management space has been on fire. As of this recording, the big recent transaction was, of course, Equifax and Count, $640 million for Count. So in our opinion, a great acquisition. We firmly believe that Equifax picking up Count puts Equifax in a very good place to compete going forward in the fraud prevention and risk management space. But what's next for a company like Equifax? Well, they need to look at the entire consumer journey, right? We introduced the landscape earlier. We talked about use case mapping. We talked about how to actually use this. Why we're trying to stop using the word market segment and start using solution segment is because all of these things kind of group together in a meaningful way. So we're seeing fraud prevention and risk management companies think about that consumer journey. And that next piece of the consumer journey in our mind is that identity verification and doc verification piece. How can they actually be a part of that? How can they control that, right? So expect some movements there. And then down right below, that's the KYC entity verification space, something that has seen a lot of growth over the past 10 years, but we're expecting even more growth as they go both upstream and downstream, whether that's lower assurance use cases or higher assurance use cases. So expect to see companies like Trulioo and a handful of Middesk, et cetera, make some big moves here in the KYC and entity verification space over the coming year, as they need to. They're on that fringe, right? We're seeing the company on the fringe. How do we become an influential player? Move towards the middle of this landscape. And the last one that I'll mention is this consent management platform and user-generated content moderation on the left. Again, there hasn't a day that hasn't gone by over the past 6 months, Cameron, that I don't think you and I have gotten a phone call about age verification and consent management. I'm going to go ahead and on a limb and say that's going to continue because it's a continued problem. And there isn't really a lot of great solutions out there in the market today that tackle this in every way that it needs to be tackled, both on the user friction and levels of assurance side of things. We're expecting a big year for age verification and consent management to be able to protect users online, whether that's protecting people against fake news, whether that's protecting younger children against inappropriate content. Whatever it is, we're expecting this area to have a pretty strong external impact or external influence in the near term. And with that, I know we are running out of time, but I'm going to go ahead and move us. Sorry, Cameron, I know we wanted to cover a little bit more, but I'm going to move us to the Q&A. We got about 5 minutes or so here to chat through things. I guess just to jump into the first question that I see here, it's what has been the most surprising development over the past, I guess, year and a half since we published the last landscape?
That's a great question. Not to toot our own horn, but I think in some ways we were ahead of the curve in predicting some of the changes that we would see. I think the most surprising thing was maybe the speed with which we're seeing a lot of these pieces fall into place post-COVID with regard to how industries have adapted so rapidly to this new landscape and really shifted to a digital-first posture. I think we are about to see a massive surge in acquisitions. I think there's a lot of transactions bubbling up in the background that you might hear about over the coming weeks and months that are really going to make a lot of these trends we're calling out further snap into place. And in some ways, I think what's most surprising is that we didn't see this movement earlier. I think we called it out in the landscape and we're a little surprised some of it didn't happen. And maybe we're going to see 2021 be kind of a catch-up year, if you will.
No, I think that's a good point, Cameron. And to your point there, not to toot our own horn, to use your own words, I'll actually call out where we were probably wrong, and at least wrong so far. And I think some of those areas are, we said basically the consumer identity applications were a dead area. That's why we saw the big rise in platforms and enablers in 2017, 18, and 19. And while that might be true, we are seeing a resurgence, and the consumer seems to actually be an active player in the development of identity solutions in the future. So I'm really excited to see digital identity wallets on the landscape this year. The second thing I would say is we put identity resolution companies kind of in the driver's seat as a golden cog. I might start to back away from that as of now. I mean, I think that identity resolution is extremely powerful, and I'm looking forward to seeing that technology deployed for fraud and risk purposes. But I think it will become a fraud and risk platform offering here soon, especially with things like Experian acquiring TapAd at the end of 2020. Those types of things are kind of indicating that we might have been a bit wrong about that as a golden cog. All right, moving on to our next question here is the biggest movements regarding investment. So I guess it's more of a general question around, what did we see in terms of investments so far, and where do we think there's going to be some movement along the landscape? I know I just mentioned two of these. I've actually mentioned three so far, including the Equifax account acquisition. But Cameron, what are your thoughts on this, on movement and investment in the space?
Yeah, I think the landscape has proven to be a pretty accurate tool in terms of where we are predicting these roll-ups to occur. Obviously, there could be some wild cards, but if you ask me to make some bets, I think looking at folks who are on the edge, looking to find strategic acquirers or investors from those solutions that are in the middle. And at the same time, if you look at a given market segment and see what some of their peers may have been doing in terms of acquisitions, and figure out, okay, who needs to make an acquisition to stay relevant, I think what market segments they abut in the landscape can be a pretty accurate tool in terms of picking up on that trend. We hit on the Count acquisition by Equifax, and I think in many ways that was predicted by, you saw LexisNexis Risk Solutions with the Email Edge acquisition. You saw iOvation getting snapped up in the space as well by TransUnion. I think the landscape was a pretty clear indicator that we might expect further consolidation in that space, and that ended up coming true. And I think mobile identity, another hot area to take a look at as well. We've identified that data is going to be a really, really critical piece to succeeding in the future. So I'd keep an eye on that market segment.
Yeah, no, definitely good advice there. To your point there, I think one of the things that we actually had in our predictions that we recently put out a few weeks ago, and we'll definitely make sure everybody gets a link to that, was simply kind of looking at a lot of the companies in the space. I mean, a lot of identity companies had great years, right? They had great years this year, 20, 30, 40% growth rates, right? But there's some companies that 100%, 200% growth rates. I mean, these are, rocket ships with fuel cruising at altitude at this point. And so if you're a company that had a 25, 30% growth rate, we are expecting those types of companies to kind of come off the market and be acquired to be a bit more competitive against these other companies that are now out fundraising at billion and a half dollar valuations. So I think that's also something to look at. Again, a lot of really great companies. Everyone had a pretty good year. At least most companies had a pretty good year. Some had phenomenal years. And that will be something that will probably shake this landscape out a lot when we look at this again next fall. All right. One last question here before we get the hook. All right. I will take this one. How is identity shifting the way companies will operate forever? I'm going to go ahead and take this. How is identity shifting in terms of the landscape? How is it shifting and forcing enterprises or other companies to think about identity and operate?
That is a great question. I mean, I think I hit on this to some degree with my mention of COVID. I think this inability to meet consumers face to face has really forced companies to take digital identity into account across how they are thinking about their entire existence, if you will. And I think this question really cuts at a lot of the kind of smaller points that I've sprinkled throughout my commentary here, which is consumers care about digital identity, not because they care about digital identity, but because they want to do the things they want to do. They want to open a credit card without a bunch of friction. They want to get into an Uber or a Lyft without concern that the person behind the wheel is going to be a threat to their trust and safety. They want to be able to, access the materials they want to access on their corporate IT infrastructure without remembering a bunch of passwords and without their company being at risk of, cybersecurity attack. What is the common thread in all of that? Digital identity. And I think a focus on enabling those true omni-channel experiences across a wide set of connected devices, whether it's tablets, whether it's smartphones, whether it's wearables, layering in the Internet of Things there, smart sensors, smart devices, those have identities too. Whatever the touch point with the consumer is or their devices and that data, placing the user at the center of that experience and in control of both their experience as a customer, as well as the output of the data created from that experience is what I expect more companies to be taking into account in that critical kind of 1 to 3 year planning that is going on right now. And I think you're going to see the winners and losers start to shake out pretty quickly here. If you can't meet the expectations of your customer in these regards, someone's going to come up behind you and steal that customer from you, because a good user experience is no longer, an afterthought. It is front and center, and it doesn't matter what industry you're in. And I think the COVID epidemic has really only served to magnify that as consumers get used to that type of high quality user experience in all aspects of their life. And I don't think that demand is going to shift once people can leave their house and go do things. I think they're going to take their time for granted even more. They're going to say, hey, I can go outside of my house. Guess what I don't want to do? I don't want to sit in line at a bank branch to do something that I could have been able to do on my mobile phone. So I think this epidemic is really going to have served as kind of a clarifying moment for both consumers and enterprises alike, that our time is valuable, and put user experience front and center. And I think that change is going to reverberate for the next decade across every single industry.
Yeah, well said. I mean, we often say digital identity is the linchpin to digital transformation. And I think that's kind of been proven out this year, but the landscape represents that. And with that, that kind of brings us to a bit of a conclusion here.